This is Algebra, Chapter 2, Lesson 2. It's going to start on page 71 in your book. Okay, velocity and speed are two different things. Velocity tells you how fast an object is moving and in what direction. It can be a positive or a negative number. Speed, though, is only a positive number, and it tells you how fast an object is moving, but it can only be positive. Now, two numbers that are the same distance from zero on a number line, but are in opposite directions, are called opposites. In the case shown below here, we have -3 and 3, and they are the same distance, although I didn't get them measured out so that they look exactly the same distance, but they're 3 units away from zero. So they're opposites. So in this case, if you were told to find the opposite of a number, so let's go find the opposite of -4 here. Well, you could do what I did and then here. So this is the negatives over here, these are the positives. You know that -4 is 4 units to the left of 0. You know that +4 is going to be 4 units to the right of 0. So the opposite of -4 is going to be 4. Okay. This symbol right here, a line, in this case A, another line, means represents absolute value, which is the distance from 0 on a number line. So for absolute value, basically the absolute value of any number is going to be a positive, even if the number we're trying to plot on a number line is a negative. All we're trying to do is what's the distance from 0 to that number. If we had, if the absolute value of 4 would be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. The absolute value of -4 is going to be -1, -2, -3, -4, but it's still 4 spots away from 0. So basically, even with a negative number, the absolute value of any number is going to be a positive number, because you're just talking about how many units a number is. So if a number is, if it's 0, then the absolute value it will be 0. If it's a negative number, as in -3, it will be +3. It'll just be 3. Okay. And so if you had the absolute value of 5, well, that's going to equal 5. And so the absolute value of 5 is 5. Let's say you had -2.3. And that one is going to equal just 2.3. That's the absolute value of -2.3 is just 2.3. Let's try -1/2. So on this one, the absolute value of 1/2 with the negative sign before it is kind of a little bit more complicated, in that the 1/2, the absolute value of that is 1/2. But then the negative was outside of that, and so the absolute value in this case would be -1/2. The same would be if you had negative and then absolute value of -8. The -8 part is going to change just to 8, but then you still will have your negative. So the absolute value will be a -8 at the end, because you had this extra negative there. Pay attention to where the negative is. If it's inside here, your answer won't have it. But if it's outside the absolute value, then it's going to have to carry over to your answer. So take a minute and see if you can just work these problems out. We have the absolute value of -4, the absolute value of 0, the absolute value of 3 over 2, and the absolute value of a negative and then 1.7. And see what you get. Okay, so after you work those out, so the answer would be the absolute value of -4 will be 4. The absolute value of 0 is 0. The absolute value of 3 over 2 is going to be 3 over 2. And the absolute value of 1.7 with a negative sign in front of it is going to be -1.7. So you might see something like this that might say evaluate the expression, and that's what we did in each one of these cases. We solved it. No, I had to add a U. I left out the U when I wrote evaluate up there. Okay, so you might be asked to do mental math to solve an equation, and you could be given an example of something that looked like this. What would the solutions be to the absolute value of x if it equals 7? So the first thing you would do is say, well, what numbers are 7 units, from 0? Well, we could have +7, we could have -7. Either one of those would equal the absolute value of 7. Another example would be the absolute value of x equals 5.1. Well, the same thing we could do here. We could go 5.1 steps this way, and we could do 5.1 steps this way. So we could have a negative and a positive. That's a positive. Sorry, a negative 5.1 or a positive 5.1. We could do the same with something like this, meaning that, we already did that problem, just a second. Okay. X equals, absolute value of x equals -2.9. Well, now we got a problem because we know that the absolute value of any number is not going to be negative. So in this case, there is no solution. To have had this, for negative to be here, there would have had to have been a negative over here to start with, because the answer can never be negative here. It's going to be an absolute value, which is positive. Okay. So a couple more examples. Absolute value of x equals 15, and 15 could be on the number line. The solution could be a positive 15 or negative 15, because the negative 15 would turn to this. If you had just absolute value of x equals -6.2, that's not a solution, because this right here, how it's written, wouldn't get a negative number there. And the absolute value of x equals 4.6, we could do that on a number line, because that could be a positive 4.6 or it could be a negative 4.6, because both of these, the absolute value of both of those would be 4.6. So you could be asked with mental math, decide if the answer is a solution or is not a solution. Well, we can look at the first one here. The absolute value of x equals equals -4. We already talked about this. There's no way for that negative to be here if this is what we're working with. So this one would be no solution. If we look at this example, we have absolute value of x equals 1.5. We know that the solution for this one could be x could be a negative 1.5 or a positive 1.5. So this one is a solution. Then we have x equals 1 over 6. And we know that that one could, this x could be either negative 1 over 6 or positive 1 over 6. So here we would have a solution. So we talked about the velocity and speed at the beginning. Now I'm going to connect it to the lesson. But just to go over it again, velocity indicates both the speed and the direction. Up is positive, down is negative. Up is positive and down is negative. And the speed of an object is the absolute value of velocity. Okay, so this is where absolute value gets used here as an example. So speed is the absolute value of velocity. So let's do an example. Let's say that the launch pad elevator for a space shuttle drops at a rate of 12 feet per second, and you're asked to determine the velocity and the speed. Well, velocity is negative 12 per second. The speed is going to be the absolute value of this number here. So it's going to be the absolute value of negative 12, which equals 12 feet per second, because we get rid of the negative number. And speed, therefore, is always positive. The velocity, it's a negative number because it was dropping. So let's say we have a parachute and it is descending, going down 17 feet per second. So what would the velocity be for that? Well, we know that it's going to be negative because it's descending. So it's going to be negative 17 feet per second. Now let's say, what's the speed going to be? So that would be the absolute value of negative 17, and that will be just 17 feet per second. Okay? Now, something that you might not, a term you might not have heard of before, it's hard to write at the very bottom here, is something called a counterexample. And that term means that to prove that a statement is true, you need to show that it is true for all examples. To prove that a statement is false, you need to show that it's not true for a single example, and that's called a counterexample. So I'll talk about that here on the next page. Okay, so let's look at counterexample. We're looking to see whether or not a statement is true or false. So let's look at the first statement here, A. The opposite of a number is always negative. Well, we know that that is false because the opposite, for example, of negative 5 is 5. So the opposite of a number is not always negative. It could be positive if you started out with negative 5. B here, the absolute value of a number is never negative. And we know that to be true because that's the definition of absolute value. Okay, your assignment it's found on pages 74 through 76. You're to do numbers 34 through 42 even, and then 51 through 59, 64, 65, 68, 69, and 73 to 75.